Thank you very much, Ashish, and for that very helpful overview of other external partners. The session is titled Other External Partners because over the next couple of days we'll be looking at a broad range of partnerships. Tomorrow we'll be looking at the United States in one session, and in another session we'll be looking at Europe, European countries, the European Union, and how all these external stakeholders relate to Africa and African countries when it comes to initiatives to enhance security and to build institutions that are relevant to current and emerging security threats. And let me just continue where Aziz ended, because he asked the question, what should strategic leaders like yourselves be thinking about when it comes to external partners? And one of the things that we have seen significantly across the continent in discussions such as this is, African countries thinking they have to choose one partner over the other or play one partner against the other. And I think the days of that sort of approach should be behind us. And now my position is that African countries should first of all identify their own interests and then see how they could utilize what various partners have to offer to accomplish their own goals. Quite too often we see the external partners and African countries working at variance, and the African countries become like a juggler, trying to keep as many balls in the air as possible. And I think that one of the reasons we're having this sort of a conversation is to challenge you to be more strategic in your decision-making, challenge you to be more strategic in how you utilize and how you leverage your external partners. And it should not be so much just to their own benefits, be it China, Brazil, India, the United States, or European countries, but how it furthers your specific goals. That means we should have a goal to begin with, right? And on Thursday, we'll be talking about national security strategy and how you could coalesce that goal around a process that not only fixes your eyes on an end state, but also discusses how you get there. So let's talk a little bit. So I have agreed with my colleague, and as a true academic, let me disagree with him a little bit. He started by mentioning that Africa is strategic in global issues. I would disagree with him a little bit because I'll modify it. I'll say Africa could become strategic. Currently, Africa is not strategic, whether it's in trade, whether it's in resource endowment, whether it's in security issues. It's not that strategic. But it could become strategic, and hopefully by the end of this this workshop, we'll be thinking a little differently about what steps we can take to make Africa more strategic. During the question and answer, if you're interested, we could talk a little bit more about some of the statistics that the evidence, or my evidence, that suggests what may or may not be strategic. But regardless of how we think about strategic, I think where I would agree with my colleague again is Africa is important, and Africa is very important. So let me focus on China. Okay. I think I'm having a slight challenge here with the technology. But while we wait, one of the things that we usually think about when we say China in Africa, thanks, Amelia. Maybe we could just have someone hit the slides. Okay. When we think about China and Africa, there's always a narrative that, oh, China is taking over Africa, or China is Africa's best friend, or China and the United States are in an existential battle for the soul of the African continent. I think that, most of the evidence is pointing in the direction that China is evolving. And China in Africa is evolving. And same way, not just in absolute terms, but also not just in absolute terms, but also relative to other donors. According to the 2015 World Investment Report, some facts that you may or may not be aware of is that China is not the leading provider of investment on the African continent. Most of the foreign direct investment actually does come from the United States. And there is a lot of healthy competition, particularly in the IT and telecommunications fields. China has also changed its model. About 2 or 3 decades ago, China focused on going in for a resource, whether it is copper or oil or natural gas, and controlling that particular industry from pump to export. Now, if you look at, particularly over the last 5-6 years, most of the agreements China is signing on the African continent is in the form of consortia. They are part of a larger group. So China is not going in alone, which means that China's risk calculus, as far as the African continent is concerned, is evolving. This is important because if we have the old, or what I call the 1970s through 1990s view of China in Africa, we'll be missing what they're doing on the continent, why they're doing it, and how we could and should engage with African countries. Next slide, please. And for those of you who, and for those of you who are interested, there's a really good book I always refer to. It provides a very interesting historical analysis of China's geostrategic goals worldwide. I like it because it goes back about 2,000 years and stops at every strategic juncture in China's history and asks the question, why is China doing what it is doing? I think if you're really interested in understanding China a little better, unfortunately, the book is in English, but if you like to have the summary version, I'll be more than happy to enter a conversation on GlobalNet with any of you who would like to talk about, what are the key points in this book and how does that relate to Africa. But I think it's a very interesting book that I would recommend. Next slide. Okay, these we'll be getting into tomorrow, but I'm just putting these 4 pillars up here. These are the U.S.-Africa policy, the pillars of U.S.-Africa policy. We'll have more competent people tomorrow morning discussing these, but I want to have them up here before I go to the next slide, which is China-Africa policy. After many years, China finally published its Africa policy in 2006, and the white paper has 4 pillars, and the 4 pillars are guided by China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. I think it's important for you to familiarize yourself with this document. It takes a lot of the guesswork out, because a lot of the conversations about China in Africa, what China is doing, why China is doing it, we depend on CNN and our local media, right? But most of them have not really read the document to say exactly what China plans to do and why and why. And the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence are also important because since the end of the Second World War, these 5 principles that underpin these 4 pillars have been consistent in China's foreign policy and its security policy until very recently, and I'll tell you where it changed quite in a few minutes. Next slide. I do apologize for this eye chart. It doesn't show very well, but let me tell you what it is. As most of you know, China has the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which the English acronym is FOCAC. And they had one recently towards the end of last year, last November, it was. And I compared the declaration signed in last November with the declaration that was signed in 2000, when they had the first Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And I noticed a number of differences, and that's what I've tried to graph here. I do apologize once again for the size of the font, but the presentation will be available on GlobalNet, and you'll be able to get it from there. The first thing I noticed that was different is the word count. In 2000, the declaration was about 1,700 words. Well, the declaration in 2015 was almost 3,000 words. A lot more issues are being focused on. The second thing is, in 2000, the guiding principles were the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. That's all they talked about. But in 2015, the 5 principles were not mentioned at all. They were replaced by 5 pillars. And the next slide, I'll explain why this is significant. Thirdly, economic development. In 2000, there was almost no mention of international economic development goals at all. 2015, they mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, so some people call the global goals, which means that China is becoming more savvy. China wants to be viewed more as an international player than a bilateral player. As far as cooperation is concerned, in 2000, there are 1 or 2 mentions to partnership. But in 2015, the document is littered with emphasis on partnership. Again, China is trying to move more from the traditional patronage model to one of partnerships, because they're getting the message that this is what a lot of African countries are looking for, and this is what makes sense going forward. And then in 2000, there was no major follow-through, nothing specific happening after the FOCAC. In 2015, there's an initiative that was launched, the Initiative on China-Africa Cooperation and Partnership for Peace and Security, meaning that China is now looking at sustainability a lot more. In the past, it was more projects. Now it is sustainability. And there are many other, things you can compare and contrast. What this tells me is that China is looking at Africa, seeing how Africa is evolving, becoming increasingly more important, tending towards the strategic, and China is adjusting the way it operates on the continent. And I think those ways are really crucial and important for us as well. Next slide. Okay. This slide summarizes FOCAC the same way that this summarizes FOCAC, and this is directly from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. They describe it as 1 upgrade, 5 pillars, and 10 plans. That's how it's described. They're focusing more on comprehensive, that is mutually or collectively reinforcing, strategic, and cooperative initiatives. That's the upgrade. They themselves are calling this an upgrade. because that's not how they did business before. There are 5 pillars, and the 5 pillars are political equality and mutual trust, win-win on economic cooperation, mutually enriching cultural exchanges, mutual assistance in security, that's a new one, and solidarity and coordination in international affairs. That was kind of nuanced in the 5 principles, but now it is out there. China is telling you what we want is to be deemed a global player, and we're counting on you and your support to make this happen. There are a number of we can spend a lot of time on the 5 pillars and analyze them and disaggregate them, but 2 important things. One is this move away. They're trying to move away from patronage to more partnerships, and that on paper could be a win-win, but if you look at most African economies, particularly economies that are now doing well, that are moving towards higher rates of growth, increasing middle class, more investment in infrastructure, those economies are very soon going to start being industrialized. They're going to start exporting technology and exporting know-how. And they're also going to start, doing manufacturing things for the global market. The problem is that all of those spaces are the same spaces that China is trying to fill. So conceptually, there is more competition between China and the African countries than there is between China and the United States. Because as African countries try to break into markets for manufacturers, for textiles, for added value or natural resources, that's exactly, China's path as well. So you have to ask yourself a question. How do you leverage such a relationship where you have unequal partners? Because a win-win assumes there is some symmetry, but it is an asymmetrical relationship. China is a lot more powerful. China has a lot more resources. China comes not just with a trade deal, but with a trade aid and assistance bill that is difficult to refuse. But this is where leveraging strategically becomes very important. And then you have the 10 plans. Over the next 3 years, there's 10 major sectors that China is going to focus on. But next slide, please. What we want to look at is, what some of the recent pledges are as they relate to Africa and African security. In September 2015, last year, the Chinese premier made a speech at the UN General Assembly, and there are 4 things that he mentioned that relates to peace and security in Africa. He made a pledge of 100 million to support African Union Rapid Response Unit, 8,000 strong permanent peacekeeping force, mainly police, a helicopter squad for transporting and heavy lift capacity, and training for 5,000 African peacekeepers. During the FOCAC summit later on in the year, an additional 60 billion was promised, and I've broken it down how it was promised, to support loans, to support trade between Africa and China, and also committed to train another 200,000. What we're not sure of is exactly whether this is new money being put on by China, if China is going to move money around. Are these and are all of the grants really going to be grants, or are they going to be loans? If you've been following China's assistance to African countries recently, one of the things they do a lot is they refinance old loans and then call it new assistance. So how much is this is actually going to be new money that African countries could use, and to what extent would African countries have the leeway to ensure that this assistance aligns with their national goals? That's one point. The second point is, would African countries, because even with all of what China has promised, it's only scratching the surface in terms of needs across the African continent. How does the African continent leverage this assistance with other assistance from Brazil, from India, from the United States, from European countries? How do we do this? That's another question and challenge for all of us. And then there are other recent pledges or developments. China now is developing a naval presence in Djibouti. So there's going to be a Chinese base, a military base in Djibouti. It's probably going to be operational late next year. And the question is, what is it there for? Those of you who are interested, there are a number of publications that we could recommend you to read. Is it there to help protect against piracy, or is it there as an outpost of Chinese naval projection, what some people have called the Maritime Silk Road? Next slide, please. So concluding very quickly, I did this chart a while ago, trying to compare the West and the East. Again, apologies for the size of the font. Looking at why the West and China, why they, well, I said the West and the East, but here it's basically the West and China, why they collaborate with African countries, what they do, and how they do it. And this chart alone could be the basis for, weeks and weeks and weeks of deliberation. But I looked at, on the why, there are geostrategic reasons and there are economic reasons. China's geostrategic reasons have more to do with its international posture and the One China policy. The West geostrategically tends to focus on extremism, terrorism, and democracy. Economically, we see more of a resource-driven model by China, and not so much, trade on the West front, but a lot of investment, as we mentioned earlier. On the what, this is where it gets a little murky. Because as I said, we're not sure exactly what is new money, what is investment, what's a grant, what's a loan, what the terms of the loan might be. Generally on the Chinese side, it's a little bit more transparent on the side of the West. And then on the how, China is usually a lot more agile, flexible, and quicker. With the West, it takes months and months of discussion and deliberation, by which time the strategic issue has either been overtaken by events or there is something else you need to focus on. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that as strategic leaders, you really have to understand not just what the rhetoric is, but what the facts are, and make strategic decisions that align with your particular goals, not where any particular external stakeholder necessarily has an interest. And there is no, to my mind, or there shouldn't be a fixed price menu. It's a la carte. you should be able to choose strategically and leverage to your advantage. I'll stop here, and I know we'll probably have a lot of very interesting conversation, but thank you so much for your time.